There we go. Okay, so welcome. Thank you all for coming. A deep, deep thank you to Professor Richard Falk for joining us today. Let's just see how far we can get in the time that we have. So I'm going to cue this up by sharing my screen. So Professor Falk is going to talk with us, to us and with us about the state of things in Gaza, international law, and the state of the US democracy. I think you all know this. He was the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories for the UN Human Rights Council from 2008 to 2014. And he's Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University. So to cue this up, I want to give just a quick overview of what's happening in Gaza. You all know this. So 40,000 deaths, people killed. That's the official estimate, and the Lancet estimate is 180,000 deaths. And then I know that you've all seen this in the news. In the last 2 days, Israel bombed 2 more schools, and there are at least 100 children, possibly up to 200 killed. And you've probably seen the pictures of the people being displaced yet again for the 7th or 8th time, most recently from Khan Yunis. And you all know that the recent assassinations of Ismail Haniyeh, who was visiting in Tehran, and Fouad Chouk in Beirut was killed, as well as Mohammed Daif in Gaza. So all of these were assassinated in the last few days, which seems to destroy any effort to achieve a ceasefire or to engage in negotiations. So we had Jihad Abu Salim at a webinar in MAPA a few months ago, and he says every time there's the slightest mention of a ceasefire, negotiations, or the possibility of an agreement, Israel responds with a horrific massacre like the 2 schools in the recent days. So our question to Professor Falk, how do I get out of there? Hold on a second, is Professor Falk, how do you make sense? Can you help us make sense of the moment we're in Gaza?
Well, it's a challenge. It's always a challenge. And I think the primary danger is that not only is Gaza continuing to suffer from this genocidal assault, but there's a growing risk of a wider war. And the assassinations that your slide referred to are suggestive of an Israeli provocation that moves in that direction and tries to shift the focus from Gaza partly to Iran and to what the Israeli and US state propaganda call Iran-backed proxies such as Hezbollah and the Houthis, as well as Hamas. So this is a critical moment dramatized by these 8 schools that have been bombed in the last 10 days with shocking casualties and very lame Israeli explanations of going after reports of Hamas presence and capabilities, military capabilities being stored in these schools. Euromed Monitor, which is a very reliable NGO that is very much on the ground and staffed by volunteers, has inspected these schools and found no evidence of a Hamas presence or any kind of indication that there was a Hamas military camp, or that they were employing human shields, as Israel contends. So this seems to be an outright civilian massacre. And as usual, the US makes some kind of moralistic response, saying it regrets what's happened, but makes no effort to exert leverage on Israel to stop doing what it's doing and to finally accept a ceasefire and exchange of hostages and prisoners and prepare the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Whether that's going to happen in this context seems doubtful. So the killing and the suffering are likely to continue.
Yeah.
You want me to say more, or?
If you have more, so yes, I mean, we are all distraught of the suffering and the suffering that's going to continue. We're distraught. Did you want to add anything more to that?
And if you were here in Turkey, where there's less filtering of the TV and media, you'd even be more distraught, because the imagery of these attacks on the schools is quite horrifying and suggestive of a total disregard of civilian innocence and the innocence of children and non-combatants, women, disabled people. It's a horror show that is seen by the whole world in real time. And that's unlike any past genocide, including the Holocaust, which was always, to some extent, disguised and hidden. And it's the first genocide, in my view, that the liberal democracies, above all the US, have actively endorsed. In the past, for instance, the Rwandan genocide in 1994, President Clinton prohibited the use of the word genocide
Hearing aids up.
in the US government.
Wait, can you show me how to increase the volume? Do
I'm
I
sorry,
hit
just-
F10?
No, hold
I'm
on.
just going to mute people.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Professor Falk.
Why are you going off the?
Audio's on, so be careful.
I didn't get this last set of comments. Were they directed at me, or?
No,
Or-
people are trying to hear on Zoom. I'm sorry about that. I'm muting them, so please continue with your comments.
Well, there's another direction of comments that could be, I think, suitably offered at this point, and that is pre-October 7th, two things I think were very important to take account of. The first was the degree to which there was a civil society consensus that the Israeli occupation had qualified now as the commission of the crime of apartheid. And very respected human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the Israeli NGO B'Tselem, as well as a study I collaborated in with Virginia Tilley for the UN ESQA, Economic and Social Council for West Asia. And all of these studies corroborated the central allegation that the policies and practices of Israel in carrying out the occupation did partake of the crime of apartheid, and that was a serious violation of international law. In addition to that, it is characteristic of settler colonial projects that in order to address the resistance of native populations, they engage in some form of racist domination and exploitation. That was true in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, the breakaway British colonies, that all had their experiences of apartheid before the word was invented, or not invented, but used in association with the racism of the South African regime. When a settler colonial project can't achieve its goals through apartheid intensified, and there still is active, dangerous resistance from the perspective of the occupying power, then it has a fatalistic choice. It can either escalate to genocide, or it can seek some kind of transformative solution, as South Africa did by releasing Nelson Mandela from prison and unexpectedly shifting their regime from one of racial domination to a constitutional democracy based on human equality independent of race. Israel, in my view, faced this kind of choice and opted for the genocidal sequence to apartheid.
Right.
That's one point I wanted to make. The other point is that prior to October 7th, the Netanyahu coalition government that took over at the beginning of 2023 was widely viewed, including in Washington, as the most extreme government in Israel's history. And what made it extreme was that it sought to complete the Zionist project by incorporating particularly the West Bank, but also increasingly interested in Gaza because of the oil and gas deposits off its coast, and because of the desire to build a Ben Gurion canal through part of its eastern section. So that one had a situation which was dramatized by Netanyahu's appearance 3 or 4 weeks before October 7th at the UN General Assembly, where he showed the delegates a map of what he called the new Middle East, which had totally erased Palestine. And so it was a provocation of a major sort that the Western media and the supportive complicit governments completely suppressed in justifying their response to what happened on October 7th. Let me make just one final point, that the countries that have sided with Israel throughout this process that started on the days after October 7th are all white dominated Western governments, without exception. And those that have associated themselves with the struggle of the Palestinian people, aside from the Hamas itself, have been movements of Islamic character that have identified and acted in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. The only government that has done so cautiously has been Iran. So you have what I call the second coming of Samuel Huntington's thesis of the clash of civilization. What is involved is not larger than Israel-Palestine or Israel-Hamas. It involves a Western attempt to, in collaboration with Western-oriented elites in the Arab world, to suppress this kind of intercivilizational challenge. And that is what lends strategic weight to the way in which the U.S. has acted throughout the conflict.
Yes, thank you. If I understood what you were saying correctly, that the countries that aligned themselves with Israel were countries who the people were white, and the people who aligned with the Palestinian solidarity were South Africa, Brazil, people from the global South, and people who were people of color. Is that correct?
Yes, of course, all these countries, including the U.S., of course, are mixed in their, but their dominant racial identity is white, and the dominant identity of those governments and movements that have identified with the Palestinians are people of color.
Right.
That's
So
why I brought in this dimension of the conflict.
Yes, thank you for that. So this is a great segue to talk about, because you've mentioned the other countries, is for us to talk about international law. And I just have 2 slides to show the audience, just to cue this up. So this audience, the Mass Peace Action audience, is very familiar with the rulings made by the ICJ and the ICC. The ICC said that they were, proposing to issue arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, as well as some of the Hamas leaders. But I just want to show here that on June 19th, that the Human Rights Council found the Israeli authorities responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and etc. I'm going to let you all read that. That was on June 19th. And then on July 19th, the ICJ issued an advisory opinion that Israel's occupation of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem is unlawful, July 19th. July 30th, there were 5 experts. I'm not sure what their mandate is, but they called on UN member states to comply with the ICJ ruling that Israel's presence in the occupied territories is unlawful. And if I didn't say earlier that the ICJ also found a ruling against Hamas leaders. Or it was the ICC actually. So our question to Professor Falk is, what chance do any of these decisions have of being enforced? And what are the chances that the ICC will get around to issuing arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant?
As far as we can tell, unless there's a unexpected dramatic change in Washington, Israel has no intention of complying with the rulings of either the ICJ or the ICC. And this advisory opinion that you correctly call our attention to is one of the most important decisions that the International Court of Justice has ever reached. And it is somewhat under the banner of what are called advisory opinions, which seems to imply that they're not obligatory. But the language of the decision itself is extremely obligatory and a authoritative statement of the relevant international law. And it's given a greater persuasiveness, in my judgment, by the fact that it is a near unanimous opinion that includes the support of the judges that have allegiance to the countries supporting Israel, such as the Australian and the US, and I believe the German judge. And there's some very important separate opinions that go even further than this majority opinion, which on all important issues bearing on the occupation side with the Palestinian grievances. That includes the phenomenon of the settlements. It includes the incorporation of East Jerusalem into Israeli sovereignty. It includes land seizures and the territorial expansion of sovereign Israel. And it includes a lot of separate international crimes associated with collective punishment and excessive use of force. So that on every particular, it is very damaging to a law-oriented justification for Israel's occupation. In that sense, it follows the work and reports of the special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council, of which I was one, as Abby pointed out, between 2008 and 2014. But my successors, Michael Link from 2014 to 2020, and currently Francesca Albanese, have gone, if anything, further than I and my predecessors went. And Francesca particularly issued a report on what she called the anatomy of a genocide, which is the most careful analysis of what Israel has done in these months since October 7th to qualify its violence as a very transparent and severe instance of genocide, given a clarifying specific intention by Israel's own leadership and by the two individuals that Abby mentioned that were indicted, not indicted, but were recommended by the prosecutor of the ICC to receive arrest warrants. That is a very dramatic step in a way. These moves, which show how clear international law is in one sense, and how defiant and successfully so Israel is on the other side, lead to a conclusion that international society in these instances of strategic involvement by the geopolitical actors like the US defers to the primacy of geopolitics. In other words, geopolitics takes precedence over international law.
Mm.
And the US has, in effect, thrown international law under the bus in the course of its effort to vindicate its support for Israel, calling the South African allegation under the Genocide Convention without any legal merit, which again, a near unanimous International Court of Justice found was a well-grounded legal dispute that was well within the legal authority of the International Court of Justice to render a decision. So it not only has there been this pattern of Israeli violation, but liberal democracies have shown that where their strategic interests are at stake, they too are not susceptible to the discipline of adhering to international law. They are quite willing to use international law as a policy instrument, as in their attacks on Russia for its aggression against Ukraine, but that law to be legitimate and respected has to treat equals equally. And it can't have this kind of morally hypocritical double standard that treat Russia one way and Israel the opposite way. That shows a disrespect for law and the use of law as a instrument of world politics that doesn't deserve the label of international law.
Mm. It's incredibly sad to me that the institutions that were put into place after World War II are proving not to be implemented by the world community. So,
well,
go ahead.
Yes, except, Abby, that the intention after World War II, which hasn't been widely appreciated, is to exempt the winners of World War II from the discipline of international law. They wouldn't have been given the veto power unless that was the case. And the veto power, in effect, exempts from international law the most powerful and dangerous countries in the world. And then you have to look
Cześć.
at the Nuremberg.
Słuchaj, przysłali nowy link.
I'm sorry, I have to.
Przysłali. Na wszelki wypadek, mi
hold
na
on a
pewno
minute,
przysłali,
please.
więc tobie na
Just
pewno
hold on
też.
a second.
A ja ci przesłałam na wszelki wypadek. Nowy Zoom link, że
Richard, can you unmute yourself? There you go. I apologize.
Maybe you can,
So please, everybody, please just stay on mute until we open it up. Please stay on mute so that we can hear Professor Falk speaking. I apologize. Would you mind continuing?
The second point that I wanted to make, in effect, saying that contrary to the pretensions after World War II, the liberal pretensions, the UN was designed to be weak when it came to war prevention and global security. And the basic management of global security was left to the powerful governments acting from their sovereign interests. And this was also true of the war crimes trials of the Japanese and Germans after World War II, which only prosecuted the crimes of the losers and exempted from any kind of legal scrutiny the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the strategic bombings of German cities, and a number of other infractions. So there was this disposition to create a double standard. There's one law for the weak and the defeated, and another law for the winners and the powerful. And a Mexican delegate at the UN was asked what kind of organization this is, and he responded, "We've created an organization that holds the mice accountable, but lets the tigers roam free."
So your formulation was quite interesting to me, that the international community has thrown international law under the bus in favor of geopolitics. Right? Yeah, fascinating. We're going to, so first of all, I'd like to ask people, we have 60 people on the Zoom. Thank you everyone for your patience. I'm doing a dual row here. I'm also doing the tech and trying to mute people. So if you would all please stay muted, and hopefully we can hear Professor Falk and his comments. You mentioned something about the United States and the powerful countries, and I just want to mention how shameful it was that the congressmen and women gave Prime Minister Netanyahu 58 standing ovations and clapped their hands any number of times. And Ambassador Charles Friedman said that they looked like trained seals flapping their flippers, which sounded
Well,
quite apt.
I putting it in more prosaic language than Charles Friedman, I felt it was one of the most shameful and scandalous performances by the U.S. Congress in the whole history of the country.
Yeah.
Who have first not only given him this kind of hero's welcome that you're describing, but to issue the invitation of probably the most overt war criminal since Hitler. I mean, it's a stark accusation, but it, I think, isn't an overstatement. But even if you don't go that far, he certainly is someone that doesn't deserve to be treated like even a normal foreign leader, much less to be honored by this joint session of Congress. And a further aspect of this is it shows how far the White House and Congress are from the of the American people, because recently, not only the protest activities in the universities, but the polls indicate quite overwhelming support for a ceasefire and for an end to the violence in Gaza. And you find no support of any meaningful sort coming from the government. So you have this clash between the government and the people that is playing out, and how Kamala Harris will walk this tightrope is something that we all are, I think, awaiting in a spirit of suspense.
Yes, very much so. So I want to get to that, but before I do, could you just have you fully expressed your thought about what is the possibility that the ICC will actually issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant? And I just read that the UK has removed their objection to issuing that arrest warrant. So have you expressed that fully?
Not really, but what the ICC has so far done is to issue a statement by the prosecutor that recommends the issuance of these arrest warrants to the Hamas leaders, including Hania, incidentally, who no longer needs one. Unfortunately, it's a very, from a number of points of view, it was a very unfortunate development, including the fact that he was one of the most moderate and well-liked of the Hamas leaders. I met several of the leaders during my period as special rapporteur, including the person that was sort of second to him as a kind of theoretical and political policymaker named Michel, who has lived in exile in Doha, and very impressive man, and very favorable when I talked with him to a 50-year ceasefire with Israel. This was back in 10 years ago. And it suggests that a lot of deliberately missed opportunities existed to have a process that was much less violent and much less disruptive take place. But getting back to, I interrupted myself, and getting back to the ICC, what this prosecutor did was to recommend to the court that they issue these arrest warrants. It's now before a chamber of the court consisting of 3 judges, and they have yet to make a decision. And it's very difficult to tell because there is some ambiguity about whether the decisions can be issued, because the Palestine, territories of Palestine, which was the original complaining country, are outside the territory of a member country. Israel is not a member of the ICC. The ICC, unlike the ICJ, all members of the UN are automatically members of the ICJ. The ICC is a separate institution dealing only with criminal allegations and outside the UN framework. And many important countries, including the US and Russia, China, India, Turkey, number of others, Israel, have not joined. So you're dealing with, there's a question of how you can issue arrest warrants to nationals of countries that have not become parties to the treaty and to the Rome Treaty that underlies the framework of the ICC.
Mm.
So it's a tricky kind of international law question. And the ICC, unlike the ICJ, has not been above sort of backdoor manipulation by geopolitical actors. It doesn't have the same professional reputation that the ICJ has. So one doesn't quite know what to expect.
Thank you for that answer. So I just want to tell folks, I have one more question to pose to Professor Falk, and then we'll open this up to the extent that he can stay with us a little longer. We'll open it up to your comments. I have closed the chat until we get there. So the next piece, Professor Falk, is around the US, the state of the US democracy, which I had here. Because you actually mentioned Kamala Harris. And what we heard from her most recently was, she was asked this yesterday, and she said a few times that far too many civilians have been killed in Gaza. Yesterday she said, but Israel has a right to go after the terrorists that are Hamas. She said, we need to get the hostages out. We need a hostage deal and we need a ceasefire. The deal needs to get done now. And a reporter asked her whether she was open to any limitations on arms to Israel, and she just neglected to answer that. I'm just going to stop that there and wonder if you could say, how, I mean, you've already spoken to this a little bit, but what are your thoughts about how she might, I mean, we don't know if she'll get elected, but how she might change Biden's policies towards Israel?
Well, I think she'll be, as she's already indicated in her campaign, she'll be cautious on this issue and talk as little about it as she can get away with. And she's refrained, you know, from doing interviews and being on talk shows and that kind of thing because she correctly anticipates that she would be questioned about just what you asked, Abby. And I think she probably seeks to modify somewhat, but at the margin, the U.S. Relationship of support. But it's unlikely to make much difference to either the Palestinians who are suffering or to the Israeli war plans and to Netanyahu's seeming interest in extending the Gaza operations as long as he possibly can and possibly shifting the Gaza theater of war to this wider anti-Iranian theater of regional warfare.
Right.
So I don't expect anything dramatic.
Yeah.
But I fervently hope I'm wrong.
Yes, inshallah. Jennifer, who's participating in the webinar, has correctly pointed out that Harris's national security advisor said on Thursday that she opposes an arms embargo on Israel. So there you go. Okay, let's open this up. Professor Falk, are you okay to answer some questions from the audience?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So folks, just hold on a second. I'm going to change the settings here so that you can post your questions. I'm going to look through the chat to look for questions that have already been posted. I think you've already answered this, Professor Falk. What are your views about the significance of the ICJ ruling asserting the illegality of Israel's occupation of Palestine? I think you've addressed that, haven't you?
Yes, the one thing I would add is that that ruling went up to the time the General Assembly posed the question to the ICJ, which was in, I believe, December of 2022. And that means that the events since October 7th were not relevant to its advisory opinion. But I'm sure that psychologically, they must have affected the way the judges saw the underlying argument about the illegality of a prolonged Israeli occupation.
Mm-hmm. Alice is pointing out that what Kamala Harris can do is very limited by Congress, so that's absolutely true. I'm looking, so folks, if you have a question, could you put it in the chat? I'm looking through here.
Incidentally, I don't fully agree with that. I mean, she could indicate by her language if she were prepared to call this genocide and to really challenge the Congress and the people to restore liberal values and act as if Israel is accountable to international law. There's nothing constitutionally or otherwise that precludes her from doing this. It's politically inhibiting because of the strength of the Zionist network of organizations, the way they're funded and the tactics they use. So it's very unlikely that a mainstream politician will challenge Israel so frontally, but it's possible and desirable in my view.
And so part of what you're saying, I think, is that the president sets the tone for Congress and other politicians. If she were to come out and call it genocide, that just opens the door, right?
Yes.
We have a campaign of no additional bombs, trying to get Kamala Harris, not another bomb. Maybe I can share this with people. We have an action that we'd like you all to take if you haven't already signed this petition, which says not another bomb. Don't be sending more. By the way, they just agreed to send another $3.5 million. Was it million or billion?
Billion, probably.
Billion.
Billion, yeah. Here's a nice question. Professor Falk, you've said that you met with Hamas officials. So do these people behave or talk like a group of terrorists? There's an assumption in there. Or do they really respect people representing their occupied land?
Well, they certainly don't speak like terrorists. The two major people that I spoke to, one of which is involved, I think maybe they're both involved in the current negotiations. One is named Marzouk. He lives in Cairo in exile. and he did a PhD in the U.S. at Louisiana State University, and the other was a physics high school teacher, Michelle, and they're both sophisticated, informed, intelligent individuals who purported after Israel, after the U.S. and reluctantly Israel encouraged Hamas to participate in the 2006 elections, but they weren't supposed to win those elections. And when they won the elections, they weren't given the promised reward of being removed from the terrorist list. And that was a big disappointment to them. And it led to this sense that what had happened was they were tricked into following a political path that when they did follow it, didn't result in a change of the way in which their struggle and their resistance was viewed. So it was partly Israel was interested in keeping Gaza as a place where it could demonstrate its skills and weaponry in counterterrorism, which made it one of the primary arms merchants in the world for this kind of training, tactics, and weaponry. So I think it was a severely missed opportunity, and the U.S. again didn't play an independent, constructive role, nor did the European Union.
Yeah. Patricia and Mike, if I see your hands, if you would hold on 1 second, I'd like to read this question. Professor Falk, what do you think is the likelihood that there's a tacit agreement between President Biden and Netanyahu? Rhetoric about how upset Biden is with Netanyahu notwithstanding. So is there a tacit agreement that Israel will be permitted and fully funded by the US to carry on the destruction of Gaza until January 2025?
What?
I wouldn't be surprised, but I have no inside knowledge that such an agreement has been reached. And whether it is an informal assurance or I wouldn't altogether put much weight on such a speculation. But at the same time, it's quite likely that Israel will continue to be supported.
Yep, it's terrible. Patricia, I see your hand. Why don't you unmute and you can ask your question?
Thank you very much. I think we need to actually realize that we have to have a solution to this crisis, as dire as everything seems. I think I tuned in, unfortunately, because of the technical difficulties, when you were describing the wrong decision that Israel made, unlike the decision that South Africa made when faced, essentially with an existential crisis. South Africa went the route of reconciliation and peace. Israel has gone the route of genocide. But that decision, we have to find a way to reverse that decision. We currently face an existential crisis, which could lead us to a thermonuclear World War III. So, I am a member of the Schiller Institute and the International Peace Coalition. And by the way, I'd like to say hi from Mike Billington, also a member. We have taken up one initiative that attempts to flank around this. It's called the Oasis Plan, to bring to bear the most advanced technologies to create rivers of fresh water to be shared by Gaza and Israel, and thereby, on one level, to eliminate one of the causes of the conflict, but on another level, to, as President Kennedy indicated.
Patricia, I'm going to ask you to shorten your comment in the
Yes,
interest of time. Do you have a
I-
question to pose?
Yes. Do you think the idea, this type of idea, this oasis plan idea, or some other idea can be brought to bear to reverse this wrong decision and keep us all out of a thermonuclear World War III?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'm not familiar enough with the oasis idea to really comment on it. I certainly think that steps could and should be taken to address the threat of World War III and the danger of nuclear escalation. It's more, in some senses, it's more evident in relation to the Ukraine war than it is in the Middle East, but one can't rule out Israeli use of a nuclear weapon against Iran. One can't altogether rule out Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. So again, it's in the interest of peace as well as justice to end this conflict as rapidly as possible, because it can get out of hand. And World War I started with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and it was not intended as a war inducing, but the cycle of action and retaliation can often get misinterpreted by the two sides, and there's a great danger that can happen. In the immediate future, if Iran does, the hardliners in Iran shape the response to the assassination of Hania at a state event, the inauguration of their new president.
Yeah.
So it was a horribly irresponsible kind of violent provocation. So I'm not optimistic that those that are making policy are being careful enough or pursuing what I would call prudent statecraft or responsible diplomacy in ways that we would hope they are.
Yeah, thank you for that. I see Mike and Kathy and Jerry. Mike, I think you're unmuted. Could you make a question and make it brief in the interest of time?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Speaking directly to what the professor just said. But my question would be a face-saving move, because I cannot believe our establishment is comfortable with the way things are escalating and spinning and moving in all different directions. We're sending aircraft carriers, and we've been doing everything wrong, as we're known to do, and eventually doing the right thing. So the right thing to me would be, I'd like your opinion on it, to basically convene a special emergency session of the Security Council, enforce a ceasefire on all sides. Then they could work through what they were basically this close to finalizing with Hamas anyway. But it would seem to me a face-saving move for us, because we really gotten ourselves hoisted on our own petard, and for everyone. And I think that would obviate the need for Iran to strike back, to save face. And that's my question. Do you think that's a good idea? I think it is.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, I think diplomatic ingenuity is certainly welcome. I can't imagine it coming out of Washington at this stage. And because people are too too deeply implicated in the policies that have been pursued to this point. And unless there's a shift in the most influential pro-Israeli opinion in the U.S., I just don't see that kind of diplomacy as having much political traction. It's unfortunate, in my view, that that is the case, and I'm worried that with the pressure on arising from the American elections and Trump appearing as the greater friend of Israel than Kamala Harris, that she will feel a pressure to reaffirm her commitment. Again, it's an unfortunate set of situations, but I don't see the UN as being legitimized in this way by a initiative that the U.S. takes. And the U.S. is not really in a good position to take such an initiative, having been a partisan of the genocide itself. It's tried, as it has in the past, to play this double role of being partisan and intermediary. And Palestinians have been badly hurt over the years by that double role.
I mean, I think we would all here say that the US has totally lost credibility, you know, as an international, as certainly as a broker, but credibility as a responsible state, right?
Yes.
Yeah, responsible state.
Sort of arrogance that it even tries to play that role,
right,
given its behavior.
right. Okay, Kathy and Jerry, can you unmute over there?
Yes, thank you. I may have missed some elements of this earlier as we were only able to get in recently, but I want to say the plight of Palestinians, it seems to me, leaves them in the role really of being considered just without value except as irritants in the region. I'm talking about policy of the generosity of our government and its involvements. And so we have I want to just refer back to a 2009 Brookings Institute paper that was talking about the road to Persia and how leave it to Bibi as to what would come. And I think that we're looking at a false separation between Washington or whoever owns Washington, the forces that own our national policy, and the kind of leadership that has occurred in Israel. And so there's this scheme to allow U.S. to militarily dominate the fossil fuel center in the Middle East. And I'm just wondering how, when we see these strategies laid out so clearly by our think tanks, and we see how pro-war elements dominating our government and excluding citizens altogether are able to create the horror that is in Ukraine now and continue to create the threat of nuclear war, we're just seems to me, aren't we being played to a large extent as we try to ascribe positive intentions to our own so-called team looking at these things, while everything we see is really showing an indifference to life, an indifference to international law, and a referral back to the Mexican observation about the laws applying to mice versus, the large cats. What?
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you.
Yes, I largely subscribe to that view. And I think that it is dangerously naive to expect positive and constructive initiatives to issue from Washington as it's now constituted. That's a very sad commentary on the moral decay of what had been the leading liberal democracy. And it had its ups and downs, and it's never quite lived up to its ideals, certainly not domestically, and also not internationally. The Vietnam War being a disregard of many dimensions of international law that went on for year after year and was supported bipartisanly, was given a false kind of Cold War justification, and the Vietnamese suffered terribly as a consequence. So in that sense, the U.S. role, while good or constructive in some settings, has been deeply disturbing in others. And one of the problems is the strength of the military industrial, what Eisenhower called the military industrial media, and I would add media and corporate complex that has kept the U.S. Bureaucracy militarized for many decades and has defied political theory that has long expressed the view that democracy and militarization can't coexist for very long. And the failure to really demilitarize after World War II is part of the legacy that we're now experiencing.
Thank you. Professor Falk, we have kept you very long. Are you up for one last question, or are we done?
One last easy question.
One easy one. Cindy, do you have an easy question?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much. Professor Falk, it's such a delight to see you again after such a period of time. I'm hoping this will be up online very soon, because I really struggled to get in and just now got in. So forgive me if my question's already been asked. Professor Falk, in terms of the UN Security Council and its impact on Palestine, do we have any hope that Antonio Guterres's call for a summit of the future might provide us any sort of answer? And what advice can you give us to those of us who are activists on the ground dealing with all these questions? Thank you.
Well, the future is very uncertain, and there is this September 22nd, 23rd Summit of the Future that is supposed to consider how the UN can be reformed in ways that would make it more effective and take account of the many changes in the political landscape since 1945. Essentially, there's been no reform of the UN in that period, and for instance, the Security Council and its permanent 5 members are very unrepresentative of large parts of the world. including there's no Muslim country, there's only China from the global south. India is not there, the most populous country in the world, and Brazil, Latin America, Africa are not represented in a meaningful way. So there's a lot that can be done, except that there are these strong Western vested interests in keeping things as they have been shaped in 1945. So I'm not too optimistic that adaptations will be made, although never has international multilateralism been more necessary to deal with climate change, to deal with migration and refugees, to deal with a whole group of issues. What we see is just the opposite, the rise of ultra-nationalist leaders in many countries, denial of human rights in large parts of the world. So unless the publics, the peoples of the world, become mobilized and active, I don't think we can be very hopeful about transformative changes occurring in the near future.
Professor Falk, thank you so very much. I don't leave yet because I want people to be able to thank you. So I'm going to turn off the spotlight so that you can see everyone. Can you see all of us, Richard?
I see you very clearly, and I see a couple of people.
If you change your view to gallery view.
Oh, to what? To
gallery at the top of the screen.
Oh, gallery at the top of the. I don't seem to have a gallery. I just have four.
On the right-hand side, it says view at the top of your screen. Does it say view?
No, it says this meeting is being recorded, and there's a leave meeting. There's a box that allows you to leave meeting, and then there are the names of 4 people.
Oh dear. All right. Well,
if you click OK on this meeting's being recorded, it'll go away.
Oh, there is an OK. Yes.
Click on OK. And now do you see view?
Yes, now I see view.
Click on view and then click on gallery.
And now I see gallery. Now
Excellent.
I see gallery.
Okay, everyone, could you
The
please
wrong site, but we won.
could you please show your appreciation for Professor Falk? Unmute and thank him yourselves and type your thank you in chat. That would be great.
You all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Wow, Professor.
Thank you all.
Something that we didn't tell anybody.
Nice.
Wonderful
I said
program.
it's very nice.
Thank you.
I hope there's a
Good to be
replay
with you.
for those who missed the beginning.
That would be great.
All right,
Thank
good.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody
Thank
for
you.
coming.
I'll say good night to all of you. I know it's midday for you, but I'm here in Turkey, where it's dark.
Thank you so much for staying so late, Professor Falk.
Thank you.
That was good. And it was well formatted, Abby. You did a good job.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
But what should we be doing now to get her elected with the Arab vote? What should we do?
I don't think he can answer if he wants to. I think it's kind of late to ask.
Yeah, but that's a really important question.
Just keep fighting.
I couldn't see.
Believe in.
Pardon? I
Keep
couldn't
fighting
see.
for what you believe
Shut up,
in.
lady.
Great.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
night.
Bye.